Piece today, as promised. I'll tell you up front, and Colonel Watts, you can just go to 2 left, 3 right, please. There is an extraordinary amount of information that goes into the deliberate targeting piece. If you thought the dynamic targeting piece was a lot of info, there's even more that goes into doing this properly. We obviously don't have time to cover it all, so I'm going to try to walk us through what targeting is and things to look for as OCs when you're out there working with the 28th. So again, please, by all means, stop me if you have any questions, or if you need me to clarify anything, or if there's other topics you need me to discuss. I can only assume, since there was only like 3 or 4 hands that went up for people that have actually seen the division headquarters, that there's even fewer people that have seen the division targeting process. I'm assuming that's a fair assumption. So I'm going to try to take this from ground level and build on up from there. Like I said yesterday, in our session this morning, we're going to talk about the planning piece, the targeting process itself, and assessments. The rest of it we already covered yesterday. So can you go to 4 left, 5 right, please? All right, these are the same slides you saw yesterday. I bring them back up simply to refresh your memory on the importance of the battlefield framework and the fact that these things need to be hashed out because it has a very real impact on our deliberate targeting effort as well as the dynamic piece. And there's a few points that I want to bring out that we didn't really cover yesterday with it. When the division goes through and comes up with their plan for how they're going to carve out the battle space, so where we're going to put the CFL and the brigade forward boundaries, and where we're going to recommend and try to influence Corps and our CFLIC, the land component headquarters, to put the FISL. We have to make sure that this is nested and that we understand that as a division, we are part of one of many maneuver elements. There's usually multiple divisions in a warfighter underneath a Corps headquarters. So we can't just arbitrarily say that, yes, the FISL is going to be 70 kilometers in front of our front line of troops, and therefore going to put our CFL 30 to 40 kilometers out. We have to understand that it takes time, and there are other units that are impacted by the placement of these overarching fire support coordination measures. And that has huge impacts as to how we carve out our battle space and our realistic understanding of tempo and the impact that's going to have on our framework. So 2 things to really talk about here with that in mind is the FISL itself, again, is really owned by the land component commander, so not even a tactical corps. So they're even recommending higher as far as where to move that to, and that's based on multiple divisions forward movement and our progress on the battlefield, and obviously what the enemy is doing in front of us. So with that in mind, does anybody have any concept of how long you could expect it to take from the moment you request the FISL to move to when it'll actually take effect? 12 hours, who said it? You got it. It's the fastest we've seen is usually around 6 hours, but that's after some heavy lobbying from a 2-star general. But typically it's 10 to 12 hours from the moment that you as a division recognize that, yep, the battlefield's compressing, we're running up close to the FISL, we're losing space for the division to shape, and we need to push that thing out. So you can encourage and coach the 28th to understand that they are just one piece in this overarching plan underneath the Corps, and that they need to be able to forecast and describe to their higher headquarters when they need that thing to move far enough in advance to make it happen.
Sure, is that because it makes it like all the pre-assigned flight paths and all the layered assets, or what is it that makes it so 12-hour?
Well, it's because it impacts so many people. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the land component, obviously. That has a huge impact, obviously, on the air component and all the shaping operations they're doing. So with so many people invested and being stakeholders in the process of putting that line on the map, from the moment it's requested that it's moved, it's got to get farmed out to a lot of people to get concurrence and understanding and plans adjusted and everything else set in place for it to take effect seamlessly.
Right.
Is the idea.
So that makes sense. So based on, the farther you shoot, typically the higher the apogee is going to be, the more things you have to worry about.
Sure.
And stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot that goes into it. Now, the other point to touch on here before we get into the details of the deliberate targeting piece is the fact that the enemy, we unfortunately don't have the Op 4 commander here to brief you on how they fight and how they'll fight the 28th. But what we have noticed is that they are extremely adept at finding gaps and seams in our battlefield framework and hiding in those pockets of sanctuary and causing significant heartache for us. So what we will end up doing, if we get this wrong, is we will have gaps around our CFL, the division CFL, and there'll be gaps around the fire support coordination line. What I mean by gaps is we've acknowledged and discussed that the division is focused on the deep area. So this is where we're trying to shape as a division. We only have, what assets really, I'll ask you the question, what assets does a division organically own to use in the shaping fight? Artillery? Yep. So your DeBarty or your FAB. And then what else?
Yeah.
Your CAB, right? Beyond that, everything else you're requesting. Joint assets, other enablers, you're requesting from your higher headquarters. So those things have specific ranges that we can reach to with given our critical munitions. So typically you're looking at roughly, for planning purposes, about 70 kilometers is really what you can plan to for a division to be able to reach out with surface fires. Now, of course, if you're allocated ATACMs, they can shoot further, but that's usually not a very high number of rounds, and that's a different conversation. But what will end up happening is as the fight unfolds and the battlefield shifts and moves and everything's in fluid motion, we will get to a point where the fissile has bounded out further than 70 kilometers from our launchers. So there is a section of battle space out here that we cannot range. And because the fissile and core and our higher headquarters are looking beyond the fissile, their collection assets and their eyes will be looking forward, so they won't be seeing things that we can't range as a division to affect. So this 5 to 10, 15 kilometer band, longer than we can range, but shorter than what the Corps is looking for, will start to emerge and open up. I'll tell you that the Op Corps commander, Colonel Payne, not the Colonel Payne that's here, but Colonel Brandon Payne, is extremely adept at understanding where that is, and he'll park his long-range artillery there, and it'll be hours, if not days, of freedom for them to lay waste to the friendly forces. So, again, not to belabor it, but this is important. Understanding the movement timelines and the process for shifting these things is hugely important. And making sure that we're nested with our higher headquarters and our adjacent divisions. What our goal should be with regard to battlefield framework and our overarching shaping efforts is to present to the enemy a seamless, integrated, synchronized fight where we are applying across the entire breadth of the core AO, even pressure throughout the entire depth of the AO against the enemy. So he can't find those pockets of sanctuary, he can't find any areas where we aren't looking for them and applying fires. Sir?
What causes that gap? I mean, I know you briefed it, is the fact that, because there's a disconnect kind of between where core looks and where division's looking, but what causes that overextension to start to happen?
Usually it is,
or?
and we can get to this, I will touch that in just one moment. Just go to 6 boat, please. It usually goes back to planning. And the biggest issue that I see units struggle with is they are unable to develop a realistic vision for how the fight is going to unfold. Because a lot of our planning effort is built around forecasting. And when we talk about the deliberate targeting process, we're going to get into that very soon, is our ability to envision what the fight is going to be over the next 72 to 96 hours with some level of accuracy for both the enemy as well as our friendly operations. If we can forecast that and we can have realistic assessments and recommendations as to where we're going to be in 48 hours and where we think the enemy is going to be based on their event temp and all these things we've already discussed, we can put together meaningful plans, which includes a meaningful shifting of the battlefield framework to account for that. The problem you run into is that it is very difficult to understand the tempo of the fight and to be able to predict where the enemy is going to be and where we're going to be 2-3 days in advance. So when those predictions and those forecasts are off, we have an expectation to say that we're going to move the fissile 48 hours from now. Well, maybe we hit less resistance than we expected, and we're now 40 kilometers further along than we expected to be. And now we're screaming to Corps to move the fissile out, and they jump it out. We've seen it upwards of 100 kilometers in advance. So it's a very complicated problem. It involves multiple echelons, multiple headquarters, and it deals a lot with the staff's ability to paint the picture for the CG so we know what to lobby for and how to plan for those movements. if that makes sense. I don't know if that answered your...
I'll throw in a little speculation here too. There's a little psychology at play. The beauty of the battlefield framework and how we lay out the battlefield geography, it allows us to compartmentalize the fight, but in such a way that it helps us to manage multiple things that are going on at one time. The TAC DCGO has responsibility for one thing, CG has responsibility for another thing. The danger is you compartmentalize the fight. It's all one fluid fight. But you know, even on the one slide, we talk about the fights, right? It's one fluid fight. The things that are going on in the cores area can impact the things that are going on in the close fight. And when you move the fissile too far forward and create a gap, that's exactly what happens. Is now you've allowed some things to live that maybe shouldn't have lived at the wrong time of value of target, and they've crept into your gap, and now they're fired. Now you got to figure out what to do about it. It just gives you a different problem set. And it's compartmentalized because the people that are supposed to be thinking several moves down the road maybe aren't looking that far deep, or they did look that far deep but didn't really communicate with the folks that are looking in the division's deep fight, and didn't communicate back to the folks that are communicating to the close fight.
Sir, you brought up an excellent point. It was something I was going to discuss in a few slides, but we'll just hit it right now since we're on it. This concept of shaping contracts, right? So if you look out here, this is a more detailed graphic here, but the division deep area, right? This is where the 28th will be focusing all their shaping efforts. And again, like we discussed yesterday, this is tied to some sort of COFOMs or conditions that we need to set as a division in order for our brigades to be successful, right? So that is our goal. That will be described in terms of number of enemy assets we want to remove, enemy formations we want to affect, different things we want to achieve in the shaping fight. During our targeting process, which we'll talk about soon, is we are also lobbying for Corps to do the same thing in front of us. So Corps is looking long at the fissile. We are going to be yelling at them to affect certain enemy formations for us to be successful as a division. And in our targeting process, what we're doing is setting contracts, where through the Corps targeting working group and the targeting board, as a division, the division commander and the targeteer should be telling them, I need you to do X, Y, and Z in the next 24 to 48 hours in order for us to be successful as a division. And that should be a very deliberate and well understood agreement that the fissile is then not going to move until those conditions are met. And likewise, when we say that we are going to shape certain things for our maneuver brigades to be successful, we are not going to move our division fissile until those shaping contracts are met, or we have agreed that the conditions have changed, or we're willing to assume that risk. So your commander hit the point right on the head. There is more meaning behind those that battlefield framework, specifically when we talk about targeting and condition setting.
You have to. He mentioned risk. You have to understand the risk that you're assuming when you make those decisions. Because if I don't understand what risk I'm assuming, I'm not even going to make any plans to mitigate that risk. In this case, I have to mitigate risk through some kind of lethal means or other means that keep those assets that are now moving into my gap from impacting the folks that are in the close fight.
We can go to 6 again. Thank you. All right, so, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Can we also define for everybody COFOMs, coalition of forces and plans, just so everybody, I don't think everybody has.
Yeah, absolutely. So generically, when we plan, we look at achieving certain force ratios for our maneuver to be successful. And I know some of our maneuvers could probably explain this better than me. But essentially, there's certain ratios in doctrine that we want to achieve. If we're going to attack, we want to be at a 3-to-1 ratio, et cetera, et cetera. We don't always see those when you compare enemy ground forces that are on the objective versus friendly ground forces we're going to apply against it. So achieving the correct COFOMs is oftentimes achieved through the use of enablers. So our ability to apply fires in the cab and other non-lethal assets to reduce those numbers to get the ratios in our favor. Is that any questions on that? If I jack that up, please.
If anybody's got questions about the COFOMs, I know a little bit about it, so
Yes, sir.
feel free to ask.
Absolutely. All right, so now we're going to get into the targeting process itself, okay? And I'm going to start asking some open questions to the group because I think since we're starting at a very entry-level understanding of it, that'll be the best way for everybody to learn and understand what this really is. So generically speaking, in layman's terms, what is targeting? Does anybody want to take a stab?
Looking for bad guys and killing them.
Yeah, that's a part of it for sure. Go ahead.
So yesterday you said we're looking for capabilities, enemy capabilities, so finding those capabilities
Yep.
and destroying them.
Yep. Yep. Capabilities. Go ahead.
The ability to identify high value or high payoff targets, enemy targets to include if we're employing personnel, if we're in LISCO, then equipment capabilities to include tires, communications, C2, sensors, anything of that nature.
Okay.
And use those, target those assets to degrade or destroy any assets.
I agree with that. Go.
Getting the appropriate effects at the time and place in order to enable our operations.
Yeah, absolutely. There was someone else, maybe.
I was just saying, delivering effects to ensure, delivering effects to get desired, to establish the desired situation without.
Absolutely.
Part of it.
Sounds like you know an artilleryman.
I'm going to define it a certain way to help you kind of connect with your experience. So when presented with multiple target sets, with an array of multiple things that you have to kill, and limited weapons to kill them, or limited attention span with which to devote to those targets, prioritizing, selecting the appropriate weapon systems to kill that target. All right? And the reason I'm defining it that way is when you've gone and done qualification, you've kind of gone through the thinking process for targeting, whether or not you realize it or not. When you get that multiple problem, you get the 50 meter, the 150 problem set, or the 150, 300, you have to make a decision on which target to shoot based on the time of target is going to present itself and really how well you can shoot the target. So when Bunch is presented with like the 100 meter target, the 300 meter target, I'm taking the 100 meter target all day long because I can't even see the 300 meter target anymore. So that's a wasted shot. And when I missed the 100 meter target, I'm going to make a decision to re-engage, knowing that I'm going to have another 300 meter target down the road, and again, I got another wasted shot down the pipe. So all those things, when you miss the target, you're making an assessment of whether you re-engage or save rounds for the next target. In a gross oversimplification, because I like to grossly oversimplify, that is the thought process that underpins the targeting methodology. Now you just have many, many more targets and many, many more things to shoot them with.
Absolutely. Inherently, there's a pretty good understanding of what conceptually targeting is across the groups. That's encouraging. What I would simply offer to add to your definitions is the way I'm trying to coach units to think about it is the targeting itself and the targeting process within the division is essentially where the division comes. It's the venue and the mechanism for them to bring the right people to have the conversation for how they are going to build their plan for the deep fight, for the shaping fight, for the next 24, 48, 72 hours. Okay, and it's to accomplish all the things that you described. We need to make sure we're killing the right targets, removing the right enemy capabilities, that we're being selective with our limited assets and understanding how and where to apply them. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with this plan. But all the division really is doing is bringing the right people into the room, and this is their plan for the deep fight. And if you remember that quad chart we talked about the other day, there is a marriage with that planning effort for the deep fight with the planning effort for the future fight with the maneuver side, really. So where we plan on getting to as a division should be driving our targeting process, right? Our understanding of what we need to achieve, what terrain we need to get to, what objectives we need to take, etc., should be driving the shaping objectives and our targeting objectives and guidance from the commander, which helps the staff build that plan, which they then, of course, brief back to them in the targeting board for a decision. So I think we have an understanding of what targeting is. So while we're on this slide right here, the next question is, when should targeting begin? When does this process start for the division? It's kind of up there. Yeah? All right, so bottom line, it has to start during MDMP, which does not necessarily correlate with when CPX-3 starts on the ground, right? So why does it have to begin this early? And there, we alluded to it a little bit yesterday, and if I'm not asking that clearly, just asking to restate it, but why do we have to start this far in advance to the exercise actually beginning? Good?
I was thinking assets.
Yes. Can you go into a little more detail as to which assets and why we need to be this early for them?
Oh, just air, like rotary wing, 16s, did 1972s, need to do those at least like 72 hours out.
Yeah, absolutely right. Can you bring up 40 on the right over here? So does everybody understand when he said ATO, what that means? Air tasking order, right? We talked earlier that the division only owns the cab and our surface fires, correct, as organic assets? But from our discussion yesterday, our goal should be to mass all of our available effects and assets to achieve the effects and the shaping objectives we're looking for, right? That includes our joint assets. So what this chart depicts here, for those that are not familiar with it or haven't had the opportunity to experience it firsthand, is that the Air Force and all of our joint brothers out there, they subscribe to the air tasking cycle, and this is a very deliberate process in order to allow them the correct time to do all the things they need to do to get aircraft ready with the right weapons and the right packages to give to you based on your requests, if that makes sense. So I'm just going to cover, because there's a lot of tension with this when we talk at the higher levels, honestly, with the rigidity of the air tasking cycle, because what this relies on, what the Air Force demands, is they need to know what they're going after, and roughly down to an 8-digit grid, where it is on the battlefield. And they need this at least 56 hours in advance. They need that 1972, which is a form that's filled out via the AFA TADS and sent up through all your targeteers and your fire cells of the division. They need those requests at least 56 hours in advance, which is usually what the BCD, the Battlefield Coordination Detachment, sets as their suspense. So the Air Force has enough time to look at all the requests that are out there across the breadth of the land component, merge together duplicate requests, delete erroneous ones. Then they have to weaponeer the correct munitions against the specific target types. They have to work out crew rest cycles. They have to do all this stuff. So the Air Force has a bunch of science homework that they have to do when they get all these requests. So that's why they essentially demand that much time in advance. Now the problem is, like we already talked about, how easy is it for us to predict to an 8-digit grid where an enemy artillery battalion is going to be 72 hours from now? It's not easy. It's damn near impossible, honestly. And this is a major point of contention that usually comes up in our training audiences. They think it's unfair and it's not realistic. There is a system, however, that allows for us to account for this. The targeting process, when we get into it, and when we talk the mechanics of the targeting working group here in a few minutes, you'll see that they talk about planning horizons. So as they go through and discuss what the battle or what the targeting effort should be, they will talk about where we are today. They'll give an update, an assessment of where we are today. They will talk about what has been, or what we forecast the battlefield to be 24 hours from now, the next ATO day. And we'll talk about what ASRs or air support requests we have submitted for that day. We will talk 48 hours, and then we'll spend most of our time talking at the 72-hour mark, and that's where we're coming up with our new plan for the deep fight, right? What you see here is what is commonly omitted by a lot of divisions, this target refinement. That should occur at every planning horizon during every targeting working group. And it oftentimes doesn't, because you'll see there's a tension when we look at the battle rhythm and the amount of time it takes to talk through all the targeting pieces and everything that we have to do. People are usually trying to rush through and get to this 72-hour mark and spend most of their time talking about what the new plan is going to be, without putting in their due diligence and looking at what they've already submitted for these days and making sure their collection plan has been looking for those things, tracking those capabilities and formations, and giving updated grids back into the 1972s and formally up to the Air Force. And then the way it should work, just so everybody's aware, is when that asset comes on station, whether it's air interdiction or a close air support or whatever else has been allocated to the division, they should check in with the ASOS, the Air Force reps in the JAJIC on the code floor, And as they're checking in on station, that's when the ASOS will give them their final target refinement. So they should be getting updated grids all along. Okay, does that make sense? I know that's a lot. We could spend an entire day talking about this and debating it.
Yeah, it does make sense, and I think what could be helpful for a lot of this group who's primarily worked at brigade and below,
Right.
is how does core layer on top of this, and how does I don't know if you have a slide for it, but essentially because core is deeper than division, and they're essentially working, a specified amount of time ahead of the division, so that they're publishing ahead and they're attacking ahead, and they're setting conditions for the divisions. So the division is doing the same thing for the brigades. And,
Right.
let's say if the division clears their H-piddle and they're ready to move the fissile or request that, then how does that tie back to the Corps? Because the Corps may, in their assessment, may not have cleared theirs yet. So
Correct.
conditions aren't set for
Yeah.
the division to move forward, the same as the conditions wouldn't be set for the brigades to move forward.
Right.
So what you don't want is brigades moving into an area where they could be impacted by something that is on the high payoff list.
Absolutely.
Whether it's air defense or artillery, radar.
Sure.
What, could be anything. I think from a maneuver person perspective, but also from an enabler perspective, how could divisions get ahead or too far ahead from a low-con level?
Sure.
And they're requesting that movement of the coordination lines too soon. I
Yeah.
don't know if we're going to get there, but I think it can help kind of.
We can talk it now. It's so there's a few things there with what you brought up. So the targeting process happens at echelon, for everybody's awareness. So what we're doing and we're talking about focusing on is what the division is doing, and that's how they're taking requests from their brigades for things that the brigade assesses needs to be removed or shaped for them to be successful. Brigade's also going to be submitting up 1972s for close air support based on their upcoming operations and what they think. And then division is racking and stacking all of that stuff and then sending it forward to the BCD. The BCD, the Battlefield Coordination Detachment, is responsible for gathering all of those requests, and they do the same thing. They rack and stack it across all the divisions that are in the battle space, and then through the core targeting process, which is the same as the divisions. There's a core working group and a core targeting decision board. That's when we should attend those as a division, and that's one of the talking points later is who is the right voice for the division to attend the core working group and to attend the core decision board to influence the core commander that yes, what I'm asking for, what I need you to do on our behalf as a division is truly important. And if you want us to be successful, you need to allocate assets against it, or you need to do these things for us. So everything we're talking about at the division level is mirrored up at core. Part of that conversation that we should be having with the core commander is the movement of those coordination lines. And there should be, what we typically coach folks to do is have some sort of a checklist of all the conditions that need to be met prior to moving our division CFL, and also prior to requesting the movement of the fire support coordination. So as you go out and OC these things, you should be asking who's responsible for those decisions. It goes back to the authorities matrix that was discussed earlier, what those checklists look like, so we know who's looking for what to meet those conditions, and then obviously who have we decided is going to be our voice up to core. Oftentimes, if you really need something, it's got to be the CG to go stand on his soapbox and lobby for assets or support in the shaping fight. And how are we arming the CG with the information needed to make that logical argument to core to get the things adjusted the way we need? I don't know if that covered all the pieces of what we're...
It does. I think it all goes back to setting conditions.
Correct.
Just like if you're playing an aerosol, you can't fly helicopters where there's enemy air defense that still exists. So we don't have air defense in the battalion, right? But if we're going to do a battalion aerosol, then someone above battalion has to clear out the air defense, and make sure that that's destroyed so that we can land burns. So if you think about that, right, there are weapon systems the enemy has that are probably not in the division battle space that need to be neutralized, destroyed, stick its attacks and then delivery. And conditions aren't set to until that happens. So that's what the targeting process is used for. So we can keep tabs on our higher headquarters to make sure that they're doing the things we need them to do so that we can move those coordination lines forward and continue
The
to.
division coming together and developing our plan for the D plan, our targeting process. So who needs to be there? Intel, yeah. Which, so there's a lot of folks in Intel. What specific people or positions?
If your HG is available, definitely your fusion tech, your collection manager,
Yeah.
possibly single sources, depending on the type of effects you're trying to get. But I would limit the amount of Intel people you send. And like I said, your HG, your collection manager at minimum.
100% correct. If everybody didn't hear that, HG, or potentially you're targeting the G2 targeting person, that they can, I've seen them interchange quite a bit. Someone from the G2, there's usually a G2 planner, an Intel planner. But then the big one is the collection manager has a huge piece to all of this. So that's good, that covers the Intel side. Who else needs to be involved?
Here.
The 131s,
Yeah, the 131s, it's a good start. If you have targeting in your duty title, you should probably be there. Who else? Yep.
From an observation perspective, sir, the div cab and then also the soft elements you might add up.
Yeah. Yeah, he said, for those in the back that didn't hear it, div cab or soft elements, that's something that's commonly overlooked in our observation plan and our collection plan, is the human element, which can be very beneficial. So typically in a warfighter, there'll be some sort of soft L&O package that comes to the division. They might not make it there in time for MDMP, but they'll be there in time for the exercise. So that's another thing to look for, is how well we integrate SOF and their capabilities, and specifically their observation ability into the plan. All right, so we got the Intel folks, we got the 131 alphas, and we got other observation assets out there. Who else needs to be there? Yeah, DeVarty? Absolutely. Any guesses at who from the DeVarty should be up there, part of this division plan?
Every time I turn around, the bar commander seems to be in every working group I ever attended.
Yeah. And that's valuable. That's a whole different discussion, which we'll get to in just a minute, as far as the role of the fire support coordinator. So the division FISCORD is the DeVarty commander or the FAB commander. They're the senior artillerymen supporting the division. And you'll find that they spend more time in the division headquarters than they do in their own headquarters. And that's just one of the nuances of the life of an artilleryman and the multiple hats we have to wear, inevitably the pain that we have to endure. All right, so go.
he's the non-lethal folks there too.
100%. Yep. 100%. Non-lethal, absolutely. Is there a hand?
Yeah.
Jag, sure, absolutely. Jag needs to be there. Okay. In the interest of time, I'll start naming a few others, and then we can bring up the other slides here. All right. So if you just bring up 12 on the right, please. So we mentioned the DeVarty. That's one of the organic delivery assets that we have. The Aviation Brigade obviously is another one. So the Aviation Brigade should bring planners to it. We mentioned the non-lethal. There's a whole host of folks under the non-lethal kind of umbrella. So your space, your SEMA, your STO, like all those specialty groups, the kind of nerds in the back tent that are typically socially awkward, unfortunately, but they bring value to the table. So you got to bring them in, and you have to encourage their dialogue and their integration into the plan, because those guys, unfortunately, their assets are almost even more restricted than that of the Air Force and the joint assets. So sometimes they have to request stuff 120 hours in advance, or even further along. So your ability to bring those into the discussion early and empower them to have that dialogue is critical. Sustainment Brigade. It's an interesting one. They're going to be there for the dialogue and the discussion on the targeting piece. They're not always going to have a huge voice or a bunch of things to contribute to it. But what they do have is this understanding of the critical Class 5 analysis. This is something that I will tell you, between the sustainment folks and the artillery folks, or DeVarty, FAB, whoever, this is one of the biggest constraints that the division will run into is your critical munitions. So your longer range rockets, so your Mike 3.0, Mike 3.1, even your extended range kind of dummy rockets, your Mike 4.5. Yeah, 45 kilometer capability. 2.6 Alpha 2s are their 45 kilometer capability rockets. So understanding how many of those you have and when and where you want to expend those on the battlefield is critical to this. And I'll just tell you, oftentimes what we see is units will get into their fight and the JADGIC will be very interested in just getting through their process. Like I described yesterday, they'll kind of be in the infancy of their development. They'll see targets pop up, they'll go through their process, say we want to shoot at it with artillery, and then regardless where it is on the battlefield, if it's between the CFL and FISTL, they'll just shoot it. They don't really care what munitions they're using, and they're just getting through their process and getting their battle drills down and everything else. And then lo and behold, you will realize that you've been shooting things that are 65 kilometers in front of you this entire time, and in the first 2 days you burn through your entire warfighter's allocation of your longer range munitions. And then as they get forward, they're going to run into a situation where all you have left is your Mike 2.6 rockets, but the enemy is significantly further away than what they can range. So now you have this major dilemma of how far forward do I have to push my launchers to get effects at the risk of losing them, obviously, when you put them sometimes in front of the flak. So the calculus and the math and the understanding of the critical munitions, and this also includes Hellfire, which is a constrained munition and not always thought about. But we should encourage the divisions, one, have awareness of how and when we want to use those munitions, but then also the impacts if we burn through them too quickly. So are there any questions on that? Go ahead, Mike.
Just one additional comment, Mike. From an exercise standpoint, when that happens, and it will happen, just about every training event, you will burn through some critical managed munition, Hellfires, rockets, something, or all of the above. That's a decision then you have to make as exercise controllers. Are we going to plus it up? Have we made the point? Do we have enough to point to reinforce this lesson? Or do we have to allow them to suffer the consequences of the failure to properly manage their resources? That's a deliberate decision that involves the exercise director, your exercise control, and probably the training unit commander. Hey, this is where we're at. How do you want to proceed? Because clearly this is not what we desire in terms of an outcome. Thanks, Ryan.
Absolutely, thank you.
Sir, is that a gameism, or is that just based off
That's
their basis
the
of
scenario
issue?
was designed based off real-world theater stoppages of munitions.
Okay.
And once you burn through those, technically you'd be out.
I have seen on multiple occasions units burn through the entire U.S. Army inventories worth of the 2.6 Alpha 2s. What? I have witnessed that personally. 3 times.
We're not making this up, it's that.
Okay, so basically, the way that it's established is they go in with the fight for whatever their standard basis of issue is, and then whatever the theater resupply plan is what is enacted, and then if it's available, they allocate it and move on.
It gets into the sustainment discussion. I'll save that for Colonel Peters. I think it's tomorrow. But there's the requested supply rate and the controlled supply rate for those critical munitions. So that your RSR and your CSR, that is a whole other step of homework that the division needs to do to understand when we expect to be expending those critical pieces. And then what is the controlled supply rate to make sure that we kind of piece and parse those out when we need them, so that we have them throughout the duration of the fight. And then he'll talk in more detail about that, I believe, tomorrow in the sustainment clause. Are there any other questions on this before we?
Does that root itself in a little bit of overkill, or because the division is really trying to fight what the Corps should follow, or they didn't do a good job with the contracts initially, or all the above?
There's a lot of pieces to it, sir. The biggest thing that I see is divisions lack patience and tactical patience in how they prosecute the deep fight. So again, they are usually, in the very beginning, very reactive to whatever the enemy exposes. So they get a target that pops up, they want to shoot at it, regardless of if the conditions are set, regardless if they have the clearance pieces already in place so that they can get the effects they want. And it is not uncommon, I'll tell you, when I was a JADGIC chief, that just through a 12, 14, 15-hour shift, that you would get 600 targets come through the box. Like just the sheer volume of things that you will see in a large-scale conflict like this is astounding. So your discipline in using your fighting products, which we showed a little bit yesterday, of your high payoff target list, your attack guidance matrix, all of these things will play a huge effect into the division's ability to kill the right things at the right time without wasting their critical munitions for when they're needed later. And there's a big tactical patience piece to this. So it took me a long time to learn. I got like halfway through my first warfighter before I kind of really figured this out. And it's, you don't shoot at everything that comes at you. Mike talked to me yesterday. He had a really good analogy. Do you want to kill the dealer or do you want to kill the whole network? Right? So if you look at it from a law enforcement perspective, you're not trying to kill or capture every little drug dealer that's running around out there. You're looking to gather all the pieces and take down the entire network for the greater good, right? It's the same thing we're doing in the targeting effort, and this gets into the dynamic piece of the plan, of executing the plan, is if I start getting counterfire out of one area, just be patient, develop the situation, understand what else is around it, start to align your assets, so then you can decisively bring to bear all of those effects and wipe out, instead of individual targets, whole enemy formations at a time. And it's difficult because you're going to have brigade commanders screaming that, hey, I'm getting rained on by artillery, I need you to do something now. And you're going to have all this tension and all these folks yelling at you to do something. But sometimes you just have to develop the situation until you get the rest of the pieces of the trap set so you can eliminate the enemy decisively. So that's the biggest contributing piece. And of course, like you mentioned, the shaping contracts and all those other components kind of exacerbate the problems. Okay. The final thing I'll talk about here, so really what we're discussing is that all the way back at receipt of mission through course of action development, et cetera, is where we bring together the targeting team. So that's when the 28th should gather all these folks to include all the external agencies that should be doing parallel planning with them and collaborative planning in conjunction. They need to be coming together during MDMP. This is where they come up with their initial plan. And their initial plan for the deep fight should get them through the first 3 days, the first 72 hours. It is through the targeting process that they then maintain that each day throughout the fight. The final piece of the plan that they need to build is their assessment plan. How are you going to determine your effectiveness or your ineffectiveness of your targeting and shaping efforts? This is something that is often overlooked. You can bring up 14 on the left, please, James. It's very rudimentary, just to have it up there as an earmark if you wanted to read it. But it's something that's often overlooked and it's often not detailed enough to be effective for the division, is how they plan on gathering assessments. The one thing I'll leave you with here is if a division expects to do assessments well, they have to put assets towards it, right? And oftentimes that's some of those critical collection assets that everybody wants to use out there to hunt targets. They oftentimes don't weight the assessment piece heavily enough. They don't put any assets to it, so then they have no idea what they've killed or if they've met those shaping contracts. And then they're operating in the blind, which is not really where you want to be. So again, we could talk assessments for 2 days if you wanted, but we'll move on from here unless there's any questions.
Yeah, but I'll make one call back to a comment he made yesterday's dynamic targeting brief. When the folks that are trying to do the assessments are focused on the individual parts and pieces and not removing a capability off of the battlefield, that further exacerbates an already challenging problem. And on assessments, the Army created an entire career field, operations, research systems analysis, because historically, we don't do assessments well.
Absolutely right. You can do 15 both. All right, so what you're going to see up on the slide, it's a very busy slide, so I'll describe it very quickly, and then there's a few talking points to get out of this thing. So on the right-hand side here, is really the major components of the targeting process. Your targeting working group and your targeting board. I will tell you just in the interest of time that this should be the foundation of the division's battle rhythm, because these are the primary critical events, with the inclusion, obviously, of your commander's update assessment and your battlefield update brief. So between your KUA and your BUA, and then the targeting events, that makes up the major touch points where the CG and key leaders are able to get a updated vision for where we are with the fight. So they can paint that picture, they can understand what's going on, they can visualize it, and then make decisions based on it. So it's in this event that he is really, the CG is going to be deciding in the targeting board and approving the plans for all the things we're nominating for the next 72 hours. And this again is also where we are going to inform him or her of what we need Corps to do on our behalf for us to be successful again with those shaping contracts. Okay, so that's what's on the right-hand side of the screen. And I'll talk about those in a little more detail in just a minute. On the left-hand side, everything to the left of this line, you see a whole bunch of different huddles over here. So we talked about briefly who is involved in the targeting process. What this will speak to is what information do those people need to bring to this for this process to work effectively. So I'm going to put you on the spot again. Chief, I think you talked the intel piece. You talked about who should be involved in the targeting process. So the next question is, what do they need to bring to the targeting working group to feed the division process?
Basically, on the target combination packets, they need to know the locations, the possible locations where they're going to move so they can decide where you can detect from. What's collecting against those assets to confirm deny their location. If we engage that asset, who's going to do the BDA on it, and then also like the follow-on process, so the assessment piece of that, once that asset has been engaged or destroyed.
Yeah, 100%. So if you couldn't hear her, she basically said you have the Intel folks, their contribution to this, which comes out of the Intel sync, which should be another huddle that happens, which could just be internal to the folks in the ACE or over in the, however they want to set that up. But they need to bring into that their assessment for what the enemy is going to be doing for the next 24, 48, 72 hours, right? Because those are the horizons we talked about. We need to understand where the enemy is going to be. You also have to talk about the initial collection plan. Was one of the things that she had mentioned. So they have to bring to that ahead of time. They have to decide, what is our collection plan going to be based on those horizons, and as well as what is our assessment of our current effectiveness. So what have we accomplished in our shaping efforts up to this point? Okay. So what about the G3, the operations guys? What do they need to bring to this to facilitate the targeting discussion and the targeting working group? What?
I'd say how much and what type of rounds it's going to take to have a desired effect.
Yeah. Okay.
Like your might goals, tying your might goals into the fight, and that's going to drive the sustainment piece at the bottom when it talks about the CSR and the RSR.
Yeah. That's part of it. Absolutely. What else? In its most basic form, what do we need to know? If we're trying to assess where we think the enemy is going to be over this next 72 hours, what else do we need to know to shape where the friendlies are going to be? So there has to be some sort of an assessment, whether it comes out of the G35, the planners. Sometimes also comes out, I've seen the folks on the code floor get tasked to come in and give updates as to where we are, no kidding, right now. But some way, in some fashion, somebody from the 28th on the maneuver side or the planner side needs to come in and say, yeah, in 24 hours we expect to be here doing this, at this combat power, 48 hours, same thing, 72 hours, same thing, right? All right, so what else? What do we think the DeVarty brings to this for the artillerists that are in the back there? What information is critical from our surface fires arm? Say again?
Range capability?
Yes, range. Where are we going to be located? What else?
Different effects.
Sure.
Different munitions can cause on the target.
Yeah. Recommendations on what our munitions can do. Also, how many of those munitions we have, and that'll shape our plan. Maybe how many launchers we have left, because we're certainly going to lose some in the fight. Absolutely right. Thank you for bringing the air clearance piece into it. The other part of this is, and I know we're running short on time here, but the other part of this is your G3 aviation folks need to be sitting in on this to understand what we're talking about, because everybody that's fighting in the deep fight is a consumer of airspace, right? So your surface fires is your largest consumer, and I'll talk about that more in the breakout session. Joint assets, obviously, and then your rotary wing assets. Everybody is consuming airspace, and they're all competing for this asset. It needs to be, and I would recommend, I advocate for this very heavily, that the targeting working group is the appropriate venue to either have the airspace planning discussion at the end of it, once you've decided what we want to kill and what we want to kill it with, or having a separate airspace working group that starts immediately after this, because it has all the right players already there. Okay, so that's again something to look for when you're OCing the 28th is their plan for the deep flight complete? Is it feasible? And the biggest indicator of that is, have they planned for airspace to support it? Right? Okay. All right, so this really shows on the left-hand side here, this is all the science. So this is the homework that needs to happen for each of the individual warfighting functions or cells or whatever. This is all the people with the running estimates, doing the math, and coming in with the raw data, right? That's the homework. The next thing to talk about is the art of the targeting process, and I'll hit this briefly. And this really goes back to who is assigned to chair and facilitate the discussion. So are there any guesses as to who out there is the appropriate person to facilitate this process? Go ahead. Yeah, if you have an idea, shout it out. Yeah. We've seen that. That's one of them. Who else? It doesn't have to, so I'll tell you up front that it's not always the same person. And based on personality and aptitude and the way the division wants to fight, the person that chairs the targeting working group has been a great many people that we've seen. Okay, so who else outside of the FISC Corps could be a logical choice for it? They would be, yeah, they'll be dual-hatted as the FISC Corps. So we've seen that, the Divarti commander in that role. Yep. Who else?
Senior 131, CW34.
We have seen it delegated down to the CW4, the 131 Alpha. Not always the best choice because they are usually very technically minded and they're not necessarily able to see the entire bigger picture of what the division's doing.
3.
I've seen the 3 involved. Typically the chief of staff I've seen as a chair. And we have also seen potentially even the DCG O or M, right? So the bottom line here, and there's 2 points I want to make, is that there is no right answer. There's some better answers than others as far as who chairs this thing. But the bottom line is it has to be a person that understands what the process needs to achieve, and they have to have the ability to draw out the right discussion from the right people to make sure that it is an integrated and synchronized process and plan that they're putting together for the division, and that they're able to deflect any of the erroneous conversation that's going to happen, because it's inevitable that it's going to happen, so that they can stay on time and on task and get through it in a meaningful way. And that's not always the easiest thing to do. And just because they're the DFIS Corps or the Chief of Staff doesn't always mean they're the right person to make that happen. So it's the 28th should find the right individual at the right level of leadership with the right kind of character traits and abilities to get through this process in a meaningful way to ensure that the division is doing all the things doctrinally they're supposed to do with it, as well as putting together a complete plan for the deep fight. So that's the art. So pay attention to how the process is working and if they have the right person running it for them. Okay. We're just about out of time. The one thing I'll say just to tie it into yesterday before I open it up for any other questions that are out there is all of this produces some sort of targeting frag order, right? And that it should include all of the products that we discussed yesterday that the JAGIC and the current ops folks need to fight with. High payout target list, attack guidance matrix, target synchronization matrix, commander's targeting objectives, etc. All of those things, to include the airspace plan. All right? That was a ton of information. We just barely scratched the surface. What questions do you have now that I can clarify? And if not, you can get with me in the breakout session this afternoon as well to ask anything. Go ahead.
Who do you recommend from the protection warfighting group to sit in on the targeting? Who have you seen most effectively be the advocate for the stuff that's on the
One of the biggest things that we're looking for in, well, first off, for the PPL advocacy piece, each of the subordinate brigades, everybody that feels they should be protected in some way and their assets should be lobbied for, largely the Divarti or FAB with their radars and launchers and everybody else, they should be advocating for their own rights. So whoever the Divarti sends up there should be a targeting officer, should be at least their S3, I would imagine. they should be able to speak to that and say, hey, 24, 48 hours, et cetera, we're going to be doing this. I have to posture myself in this PAA. In order for me to be survivable, I need, air defense assets added to whatever. So they should advocate for themselves. To answer your question, for the whole division piece, I like to see air defense officers in there because there's inevitably a discussion of just essentially the overall umbrella of air defense that the division should be trying to create. And it's a balance between point and area of protection and all the other nuance that goes in that. But that is usually a venue for help. So air defense is a good one. And then the other piece, and I'll just tell you up front, units usually do not target enemy counter-mobility assets early enough, specifically their mine layers. It's usually an afterthought. Sometimes it's based on range, and we should be advocating to Corps to kill those early and often for them. So whoever it is, whether it's the actual engineer that comes into the targeting working group to discuss that, but I would say a good indicator of if they have a good understanding of how the fight's going to go is if they have enemy engineer assets, mine layers on their initial target nominations up to Corps, as well as on their own high payoff targets. Does that cover? Okay.
What about, so what about EW? I don't see EW up here. We see a lot of CTCs where most of us have experience, but when it comes to a warfighter, is there anybody that...
Yeah, they're not mentioned by name, but it's all this non-lethal. Everywhere it says non-lethal, EW is wrapped into that.
Okay.
And they're a huge part of it. And part of the challenge is a lot of those folks, if you don't have the right person running the meeting that understands the art of it and how to drag people to get them involved and integrated, a lot of the times those folks will stand along the back of the tent and they'll just be there silent, they'll just take some notes, and then they'll go back and they'll request assets because they're trying to be helpful and value added, but it's not necessarily integrated and synchronized into the plan. So then you'll see when it comes to execution, you'll be out in the JAGIC and you'll have an asset that's up and jamming and doing something in a portion of the AO, which is not tied to anything else, no other delivery assets, no other cab attack, nothing else the division's doing. And when you trace that back, it goes back to their involvement in the working group and bringing them in to make sure the whole plan is synchronized. And I can talk, so in the breakout this afternoon, I'll talk more about, it's titled Fire Sport Planning and Airspace Planning, but it's really how do we create these synchronized plans for the division in the deep fight in a more meaningful way than what we typically see right now, if that helps. Good.
So one thing that I was asked for is, I know that they exist, but for divisions and war fighters, is it still a theater asset when you're talking about, the offensive cyber operations, or is that something that divisions request on behalf of through the non-lethals, or is that something that hasn't reached it to the fruition of war fighting yet for us?
So I'll defer to anybody else if they've seen definitively, but I haven't seen on the friendly side any truly offensive cyber capabilities employed in warfighting. Go ahead, Mitch.
I'll say, 2ID have a really good piece of their own enemy 88 threat. So I know they did that really well. It's highlighted in the recent warfighter last November with that. So the 2ID non-lethal officer, and I try to reach back and get his point of contact information. But they did a very good job using that in a relatively offensive capacity.
Thank you. All right, is there anything else before I turn it over to the head table? And again, I'll run around the rest of the week to ask questions if you think of anything else. All right, sir.
The only thing I'll say quick is the targeting meeting is a central part of everything the CG is going to do, right? He'll go to that, the O, if he's located at the same location, will be there. I mean, it's a full house. It just needs to be well organized. They need to have a solid 7-minute drill. They need to rehearse it. They need to make sure that it's CPX 3, 2, and 3, that they're working toward getting ahead of this problem. Otherwise, they will always be behind it. And as the planning, the planning horizons collapse between the 5, the 3.5, and the 3.3, things kind of like an accordion, it'll desync some of what goes on at that targeting meeting. So they really need to try and fight to make sure that they have good structure to that, if that makes sense. And Ryan will cover more of that at the at the breakout.
Hey, he mentioned it. You guys, how many have heard or not? How many have heard the term 7-minute drill? Raise your hand. All right. So a good portion of you. If you haven't heard 7-minute drill, so that you can walk into not having run a meeting before and see what it is that you're supposed to do, what you're supposed to get out of it. And the reason that's important, if you probably sense it from just the stuff on that one slide where he laid out which working groups, who attends the meeting, who chairs it. They're going to be managing a vast volume of information. And if they're not disciplined, if they don't understand inputs, outputs, and they're not disciplined about running those meetings, if you expand that out into running a battle rhythm, they're going to be hopelessly, they're going to be struggling quite a bit. So if they can't run a meeting, it's probably a good indicator that as you start probing and looking at the battle rhythm writ large, you're not going to be able to do that either. So they're not going to be able to manage the information flow and fight the fight that they're trying to be able to fight as a division. So another good indicator, we talked about layouts, setup of the talk, how they run a meeting, how the battle rhythm is sequenced to get to decisions. All those things are things that you can look at walking into the 28 CPXs and get indicators of how successful that they're going to be and what problems that kind of help you narrow down in on the problems that they're having that are keeping from doing what they need to do.
Thanks, sir. 5 minutes.
Hey folks, we're adjusting the schedule a little bit. No worries, we're right on schedule now.